Rydian leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the auction listing on his holoscreen. He'd spent years rummaging through forgotten shipwrecks, unclaimed cargo, and decommissioned military tech, piecing together scraps of the universe to sell to eccentric collectors or engineers willing to pay for spare parts. Most of the time, these so-called exclusive finds turned out to be nothing more than rusted-out hull fragments or defective AI cores. But something about this one was different. The listing was vague. Unregistered pre-Terran artifact, fully intact, high collector's value. No specifications, no images, just a promise of something valuable. It smelled like a scam, but Rydian had learned that the best finds often hid behind the worst descriptions. He'd placed a bid just above the starting price, half expecting to be outbid by some corporate vulture in a matter of minutes. Instead, his account had been charged, and the transaction was finalized before he could even process what had happened. That was his first warning sign. The second came when the delivery arrived less than 12 hours later. No courier, no customs clearance, just a nondescript transport drone dropping a massive sealed crate at his workshop door in the dead of night. Rydian stood there for a long moment, staring at it. He wasn't sure why his stomach twisted the way it did. He'd bought black market goods before, decommissioned tech, alien relics, even pieces of classified military prototypes. But this felt different. Wrong. He stepped forward, fingers running over the crate's surface. It was sleek and black, the kind of reinforced material used for high-security containment. A small control panel flickered to life at his touch, scanning his biometrics before a soft hiss escaped the seams. The locks disengaged with a low, mechanical thunk. The front of the crate slid open. His breath caught in his throat. Inside, curled up in what looked like a nest of shimmering fiber, was a girl. No, not a girl. Her skin was deep obsidian, laced with faint golden patterns that pulsed gently, like starlight trapped beneath a darkened sky. Her hair, a cascade of twilight strands, hovered weightlessly around her, untouched by gravity. And her eyes, they were molten silver, luminous. Watching him, she shifted slightly, the biofiber around her crackling with tiny arcs of energy. The air in the workshop felt charged, heavy with something Rydian couldn't name. She blinked, slow and deliberate, as if waking from a long slumber. Then, in a voice like distant chimes carried on the wind, she spoke. "Did you purchase me?" Rydian took a sharp step back, his heart hammering. What the hell had he just bought? His mind scrambled for logic. This had to be a mistake. He had bid on an artifact, an inanimate object, a piece of history, maybe a derelict AI core at worst. But this was a person, a living, breathing alien. She shifted, sitting up slightly, the fiber-like cocoon around her parting like liquid metal. Her movements were fluid, unervingly graceful, as if she were made of something lighter than air. But her eyes, her human eyes, held something deep, something ancient, something lost. She tilted her head, watching him the way a scientist might observe an unfamiliar creature. "You are afraid." He swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at him to shut the crate and pretend he had never opened it. But he couldn't. His voice caught. "I didn't know. I thought I was bidding on salvage, not a person." Something flickered across her face. Understanding, maybe. Her fingers brushed over the crate's interior, the golden lines on her skin brightening for a brief moment before fading again. "They did not tell you what I was," she murmured. It wasn't a question. Rydian exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Who are you?" She hesitated. Her lips parted, but no answer came. Instead, she glanced past him, eyes darting around the workshop. The dim glow of the workbenches reflected in her gaze. Disassembled drones, half-constructed ship cores, old stasis pods that had long since lost their charge. She inhaled slowly, as if tasting the air. "This place, it is strange." "You're in my workshop," he said cautiously. "On Earth." Her eyes snapped back to him, something sharp flashing in them. "Earth. You know it." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pressed a hand against the inside of the crate. The golden patterns on her skin shimmered again, and for a split second, Rydian swore the crate reacted to her, like it recognized her touch. Then she looked at him again, and this time, there was something behind her expression, something almost hesitant. "They took me," she whispered. Rydian stiffened. "Who?" A pause. Then softly, "I do not know their names, only the shadows they left behind." He wasn't sure what that meant, but the way her fingers clenched the side of the crate told him enough. Someone had captured her, transported her, sold her, and now she was here, in his workshop. A sharp knock at the workshop door made Rydian's breath catch. His pulse spiked. No one came here unannounced. The girl tensed, her luminous eyes locking onto him. "They are coming," she whispered. Rydian didn't know who they were, but he knew one thing. He wasn't about to let them take her again. His fingers flew across the crate's control panel, overriding the security locks. The panel flickered, then powered down, sealing the crate permanently in standby mode. He grabbed the nearest cloth, a worn-out flight jacket, and tossed it over the girl, covering her shimmering skin as best as he could. The knock came again, harder this time. Rydian took a slow breath, steeling himself before striding to the door. He hit the external cameras, but the feed was dead. That wasn't a good sign. He opened the door just a fraction. A man stood on the other side, broad-shouldered, dressed in a sleek black uniform, the kind that didn't belong to any official Earth government. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, cold and calculating, swept over Rydian like he was nothing more than an obstacle. "Rydian Vale," the man said. Not a question. A statement. Rydian didn't correct him. "Who's asking?" The man didn't blink. "A shipment was misdirected to your location. We are here to retrieve it." Rydian forced his expression into something bored, leaning lazily against the doorframe. "I get a lot of shipments. You'll have to be more specific." The man's jaw tensed. "We do not have time for this." He stepped forward, but Rydian held his ground. "Then maybe you should have double-checked your delivery address before sending me a mystery box," Rydian said, crossing his arms. "Not my problem." The man's gaze darkened. He glanced past Rydian, toward the interior of the workshop. "You opened it." It wasn't a question. Rydian's stomach turned to lead. "No idea what you're talking about." For a moment, the man simply stared at him, measuring, calculating. Then he exhaled sharply, stepping back. "If you find anything inside that does not belong to you," he said smoothly, "I advise you to report it." And then, without another word, he turned and left. Rydian watched him go, his pulse thrumming in his ears. The second the man disappeared into the night, he shut the door and locked it. Silence. Then, behind him, the girl's voice, soft, almost uncertain. "You did not give me to them." Rydian turned to face her. She had pulled the jacket tighter around herself, her silver eyes watching him warily, as if waiting for the moment he might change his mind. He exhaled. "No," he said, "I didn't." And deep down he already knew he never would. Rydian paced the length of his workshop, his thoughts racing as he tried to process everything. The girl, Inarius, as she finally told him, sat quietly on the edge of his workbench, watching him with those luminous silver eyes. She hadn't spoken much since the men had left, but she didn't need to. The tension in the air was enough. "You were running from them," he finally said, stopping mid-step to look at her. "Who were they?" Inarius lowered her gaze, her fingers tracing the faint gold patterns along her forearm. The markings pulsed softly, like distant stars flickering through the void. "They are not of my kind," she murmured, "but they seek to unravel what I am." That answer wasn't nearly enough. "Unravel?" Rydian repeated. "That doesn't sound like they just wanted to bring you home." Her lips pressed together, and for a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I was taken, sold, passed through many hands that did not understand me, until you." The weight of her words settled over him. He had spent years salvaging lost things, digging through the remnants of old battles and forgotten wreckage. But this wasn't a piece of technology or a scrap of history. This was a person, one who had been stolen and sold like cargo. A sick feeling twisted in his gut. "Why you?" he asked. "What makes you so valuable?" She hesitated, then slowly raised a hand. The air around her fingertips shimmered, tiny golden arcs of energy dancing between them. The workshop's overhead lights flickered, reacting to something unseen. Tools shifted slightly on the metal surface of the workbench, drawn toward her as if responding to an invisible force. Rydian had seen a lot of strange tech in his life. He had worked with ancient alien circuitry, deactivated AI cores that still whispered echoes of their creators' voices. But this wasn't tech. This was something else. He swallowed. "You're connected to a energy?" She tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "Not energy. Threads. The strands that bind the stars. The pulse that shapes the void. I can hear it, feel it, and touch it." His mind struggled to grasp the idea. "You mean like gravity? Electromagnetic fields?" A soft smile curved her lips, though there was something almost sad in it. "Your kind gives names to things you do not yet understand." Rydian ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Okay, say I believe you. What do they want from you?" Her expression darkened. "To cut me apart until they do understand." A cold chill ran down his spine. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The distant hum of aerial patrols echoed faintly outside, a reminder that the men who had come looking for her were still out there. She was in danger, and now so was he. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I should get you off-world," he muttered. "Find a way to send you home." Her gaze flickered with something unreadable. "I cannot return." Rydian frowned. "Why not?" She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "Because there is nothing left." The way she said it, softly resigned, sent a pang through him. He had no idea where she had come from, but that answer told him all he needed to know. She had no home to go back to. Something in his chest tightened. He knew what it was like to have nothing, to be adrift. The difference was he had chosen it. Inarius had not. She shivered suddenly, her body trembling as the golden markings along her skin pulsed erratically. Rydian moved without thinking, reaching out to steady her. The second his hands touched her arms, a shock ran through him. Not painful but warm, like static electricity thrumming beneath his skin. Her breath hitched. Her fingers curled slightly against his. "Are you hurt?" he asked, brow furrowed. She shook her head slowly. "No, it is different. You are different." He wasn't sure what she meant, but before he could ask, she pulled back slightly. The warmth between them faded, but the ghost of it lingered on his skin. "You should not involve yourself in this," she said softly. "They will come again." Rydian huffed a dry laugh. "Yeah, I figured, but I'm already involved." He gestured toward the sealed crate. "Unless you plan on climbing back in there and mailing yourself somewhere else, I don't see how I can just ignore this." Inarius studied him for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. For the next few days, he kept her hidden. He modified the workshop security, blacked out his tracking logs, rerouted his network signals to make it look like he had left the city entirely. He had no idea who those men were working for, but if they had the kind of resources to track an unregistered alien life form across planets, then they weren't going to give up easily. Inarius spent most of her time observing, watching him repair drones, listening as he explained old human machines. She was fascinated by the way humans built things, how they took pieces of broken pasts and made them function again. "You're kind," she mused one evening, her fingers tracing the shape of an old engine core. "You create with such urgency, as if you fear time will steal everything from you." Rydian smirked. "That's not far from the truth." She tilted her head. "Why?" He thought about that for a moment. "Because we don't live forever." Inarius was silent, her gaze flickering with something he couldn't quite name. That night, she asked him about love. "Your people," she murmured, sitting cross-legged on the floor as she watched the stars through the high windows of the workshop. "You love so deeply, even knowing your lives are fleeting. Why?" Rydian leaned back against the workbench, arms crossed. Because that's what makes us human. She turned to look at him. Then, what does that make me? The question caught him off guard. He didn't know how to answer. For all the strange, impossible things about her, Inarius felt human. Maybe not in biology, but in something deeper. The way she hesitated before speaking, the way her fingers lingered over the objects in his workshop like she was memorizing their existence. The way she looked at him, not with the gaze of some cosmic entity beyond comprehension, but with the quiet curiosity of someone longing to understand. He met her silver eyes, his voice quieter this time. I don't know. Inarius reached out then, her fingers brushing against his wrist. The same warmth from before returned, but this time, it wasn't fleeting. It lingered, settling in his skin, in his chest. For a moment, neither of them moved. You are warm, she murmured, almost as if in wonder. Rydian swallowed. And you're not. She didn't answer, but the way her fingers curled slightly against his told him enough. He wasn't sure how long they stayed like that, the quiet hum of the city outside the only sound between them. But he knew one thing. She wasn't just an artifact. She wasn't just a runaway. She was something far more. And he wasn't about to let anyone take her away. The days stretched into nights, and Rydian found himself falling into an uneasy rhythm with Inarius. She was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Alien, yes, but also deeply familiar in ways that unsettled him. The way she watched him work, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way she whispered to the air as if the universe itself could hear her, and the way she looked at him. He had told himself that keeping her here was a temporary thing, that the moment he found a way to get her to safety, he would let her go. But every day that passed made it harder to imagine a world where she wasn't here. She was learning, not just about his workshop or the technology humans cobbled together, but about him. Your hands are different, she observed one evening, as he sat cross-legged on the floor, repairing a stabilizer core. She had settled beside him, close enough that he could feel the faint warmth of her presence, though her skin itself was always cool. He glanced at her, raising a brow. Different how? Inarius reached out, her fingers ghosting over his palm. They are rough, calloused, worn by time. They have built, taken apart, fought, survived. He swallowed. You get all that from just looking? Her lips curved slightly, but there was something thoughtful in her expression. No, from touching. Rydian found himself holding his breath as she ran her fingers over his palm, tracing invisible lines. It was such a simple thing, yet his skin burned where she touched, as if she was leaving something behind. You are not afraid of me anymore, she murmured. He wasn't, not even a little. But before he could say anything, the security alarm blared. Rydian was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his pulse rifle from the workbench and flicking through the security feeds. Static. Someone was jamming the signal. Inarius, he said sharply, turning to her. Hide. Now. She didn't argue. She simply disappeared into the shadows of the workshop, her form flickering like she was part of the darkness itself. Rydian forced himself to breathe, moving to the entrance as the pounding on the door echoed through the space. It wasn't a polite knock this time. Whoever was out there wasn't asking for permission. He barely had time to react before the door burst inward. The man from before stepped inside, flanked by two others in the same sleek, black uniforms. Their weapons were drawn, their expressions cold and unreadable. Where is she? The man demanded. Rydian didn't flinch. No idea who you're talking about. The man sighed, tilting his head slightly. I gave you a chance, Vale. The two men beside him moved at once. Rydian swung up his rifle, but he was too slow. One of them slammed the butt of a weapon into his stomach, knocking the breath from his lungs. He hit the floor hard, gasping, but before he could recover, they had him pinned, a boot pressing into his shoulder. She is not human, the man said calmly, crouching beside him. She is not yours to keep. Rydian gritted his teeth. She's not yours either. The man's expression didn't change. That is where you are wrong. There was a flicker of motion behind them, a shadow shifting, the air around it crackling with unseen energy. Then the lights exploded. The room plunged into darkness. Sparks rained down like tiny stars. And in the chaos she moved. Inarius was not like them. She did not fight with fists or weapons. She fought with something older, something deeper. The golden lines along her skin blazed, illuminating the room in brilliant, pulsating light. The air rippled, bending to her presence. And then, the men screamed. Their weapons snapped apart, disassembled by invisible hands. The metal in their uniforms twisted, bending around their limbs, forcing them to their knees. The man who had spoken to Rydian gasped, his body trembling as if caught in a current too strong to resist. His eyes darted to Inarius, wide with something that almost looked like fear. You, he choked out. You were supposed to be dormant. Inarius stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The golden glow around her pulsed, and Rydian swore the entire room responded to her presence. The walls shuddered. The very air hummed. You would break me apart, she said softly. You would take what you do not understand. But you forget. She lifted a hand. The man rose into the air, his body writhing against an unseen force. I am not yours to take. A sharp, electric crack split the air, and the men collapsed, unconscious before they even hit the floor. Silence. Rydian pushed himself up, his breath coming in uneven gasps. His pulse was pounding, but he wasn't afraid. Inarius stood in the center of the workshop, her golden light slowly fading, returning to a soft pulse beneath her skin. She turned to face him, and for the first time, she looked uncertain. You are afraid of me now, she murmured. Rydian took a slow breath, then shook his head. No, I'm afraid for you. She tilted her head. Why? He glanced at the unconscious men. Because now they know what you can do. She studied him for a long moment. Then, quietly, she asked, what happens now? Rydian exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had no idea what kind of forces he had just made enemies of, but one thing was clear, they weren't safe here anymore. We leave, he said. We get off-world before more of them come. Inarius nodded slowly, but something flickered in her silver eyes. Something unspoken. You will run with me, she murmured. It wasn't a question. Rydian hesitated, but deep down he already knew the answer. He met her gaze. Yeah, he said softly. I will. And for the first time since she had arrived, she smiled. The old cargo ship groaned as it powered up, its engines rumbling to life beneath the worn hull. Rydian moved swiftly through the cockpit, fingers flying over controls, rerouting fuel reserves, overriding security clearances, and masking their launch signature. He wasn't the best pilot in the galaxy, but he had spent enough time salvaging old wrecks to know how to make a ship disappear. Inarius stood behind him, silent but watchful. The golden patterns along her skin had dimmed since their escape from the workshop, but he could still sense the quiet power humming beneath the surface. She hadn't spoken much since they'd left, but she didn't need to. The weight of what had happened, of what was still coming, hung heavy between them. Almost there, Rydian muttered, running a final diagnostic. The ship's artificial gravity stabilized, the engine core pulsed in rhythm with the power grid, and proximity alarm blared. Damn it, he cursed, spinning the display toward him. A ship was closing in fast. Not just any ship, a military-class hunter vessel. Sleek, deadly, built to track and capture high-value targets. Can you outrun them? Inarius asked softly. Not in this old thing, he admitted. But I can outmaneuver them for a while. Hopefully long enough to get us off-world. She moved closer, standing beside him as he prepared the thrusters for an emergency ascent. I can stop them, she murmured. Rydian turned to her sharply. No, no more of that. Her silver eyes flickered with something unreadable. You saw what they would do to me. Yeah, he said, his voice quieter now. And I also saw what it does to you when you use that power. She hesitated, He could see it, the conflict warring within her, the instinct to protect herself against the cost of doing so. "I'll get us out of this," he promised. "Without you burning yourself out." She didn't argue, but she didn't look convinced either. The hunter vessel loomed closer on the radar. Then came the warning hail, a sharp, static-filled message that carried the cold authority of men who had already decided their prey wasn't getting away. "Unidentified freighter, you are in possession of stolen biological property. Power down and prepare for immediate boarding." Ridian gritted his teeth. "Yeah, that's not happening." The ship lurched as he pulled them into a steep climb, pushing the engines to their limit. The hunter vessel reacted instantly, breaking into a pursuit vector, weapons locking onto their trajectory. Ridian twisted the controls, sending them into a barrel roll that just barely avoided an incoming pulse blast. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to focus. He had one advantage. He knew this planet's orbital debris field better than they did. "Hang on," he warned. Inarius braced herself against the console as he angled the ship toward the remnants of an old satellite cluster. The jagged ruins of long-abandoned stations and forgotten wreckage floated in low orbit, a graveyard of lost technology. The hunter vessel followed. Ridian weaved through the debris, pushing the ship harder than it had likely been pushed in decades. Metal fragments scraped against the hull, proximity alarms screamed, but he didn't let up. He could see the larger wreck ahead, the twisted remains of a cargo hauler that had been drifting here for years. A plan formed in his mind. He cut the engines. The sudden lack of thrust threw them into an uncontrolled spin, hurtling straight toward the wreck. The hunter vessel, expecting a clean chase, faltered, just for a second. That second was all he needed. Ridian reactivated the engines at the last possible moment, shifting their trajectory just enough to graze the wreck while the hunter vessel, unable to adjust in time, slammed directly into it. A silent explosion rippled through space as metal crumpled and debris scattered. The hunter vessel wasn't destroyed, but it was disabled. They wouldn't be following anytime soon. Ridian exhaled sharply, hands shaking as he stabilized the ship. That was close. He turned to Inarius, expecting her to look shaken. Instead, she was staring at him with something like awe. "You are unlike them," she whispered. He frowned. "Who?" "The ones who took me. They wield machines, but they do not understand them. You move as if the ship is part of you." Ridian huffed a tired laugh. "I've spent more time with machines than people. Guess that counts for something." Inarius studied him for a long moment. Then softly, she said, "You saved me." The way she said it, it wasn't just gratitude. It was disbelief, as if no one had ever done such a thing for her before. Something in Ridian's chest tightened. He looked away, focusing on the NAV system. "Yeah, well, you kind of saved yourself too." She reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand. Quiet, lingering touch. "I am glad it was you," she murmured. He turned to her, their eyes meeting. There was something between them now, something unspoken, but undeniable. For the first time in his life, Ridian wasn't just running from something. He was running toward something, and as the ship carried them away into the unknown, he realized he didn't want to stop.